Today with these three stories, I'll hopefully give you one shock moment, or at least give you a home moment. But with all that being said, let's begin. Born on December 29th, 1996, Jolene Callahan grew up living the quite ordinary American life. She would have two loving parents, a white picket fence for a modest home. She would also have a nice cuddly dog. So it was safe to say that she had a quite normal but content life. Her school life really peaked in high school, as she was known for this 4'10" popular girl who was known to dye her hair punky pink and other shades of colour like purple. But later on in her high school life, she would meet a boy named Lauren Daniel Bunner. When the two first met, it wasn't really the best interaction, but somehow they would manage to go on their first date, and eventually that date would be successful and they would become into a couple. Now Daniel seemed like a really nice guy that made Jolie happy, but there was one thing that really bugged Jolie about Daniel. It was how overprotective he was with her and definitely over possessive with her. At first she ignored and just chalked her up to him just being worried and just being a good boyfriend, but eventually things would become worse, to the point where Daniel wasn't even letting her go out with her friends because he wanted her to spend time with his friends instead. And at this point Jolie knew that this was way too much for her, and they would go on to have this massive argument, and eventually this massive argument would lead to a breakup in the relationship. Once the relationship was over, Jolie had this massive relief that came over her, and also this massive pressure that was lifted up off her shoulders. But for Daniel, it was the opposite. He knew that he made a mistake, and for the next couple of weeks after they broke up, he would try to do everything to win Jolie back, but just unfortunately for him, nothing would work. Jolie was intent of keeping their relationship just as friends because she wasn't going to go through that experience again. And even though in her brain she kind of thought that he might change, but she didn't want to find out. Now yes, even though they had broke up, this wasn't the first time that Jolie tried to break up with Daniel. There were many points in their relationship that she wanted to call quits, but she couldn't, because why? Every time she would tell Daniel that she wanted to end the relationship, he would threaten her by telling her that he was going to end himself if she broke up. This would keep Jolie with Daniel, but of course against her will. And at the end where they had that massive argument, the argument was big enough to the point where Jolie said, "I don't care anymore. Just please get me away from you. You are hurting my life right now." Now skipping some time, merely a couple of months, and Jolie had forgot about this whole ordeal, and she would actually go on to have a new partner. So now she's living this good life with a new boyfriend. She gets a text message from none other than Daniel, but this time it wasn't a "sorry, can we please make this work?" or some other, let's fix it text message. It wasn't one of them. It was actually a text message of Daniel saying, "Hey, I know it's been a while. I was hoping that you would come hiking with me as friends." Jolie looked at the message and quickly dropped her phone and was like, "Nope, I don't want anything to do with him right now." But after a bit of self-thought and thinking about the situation, she was like, why not? We ended the relationship in a bad way, and if I go on this hiking trip with him, at least it could mend our friendship. So she would proceed to text him back saying, "Yeah, sure, that'll be great." So with the plan set, Jolie would lay down on the bed and text her friends for a bit before ultimately she would go to bed. Now it's the next morning, August 30th, and Jolie would wake up bright and early and then would get ready, and then pretty quickly she heard a car honk outside of her house, and so this indicated that Daniel was here. Jolie wasn't going alone on this hiking trip with Daniel. She was bringing in a guest, a dog, Kiba. So once Jolie got inside with Kiba, Daniel would give her a hug and then would proceed to say, "Let's get going." The two, or should I say the three, would arrive at the Pinhoti Trail, which was in the Chia State Park in the Alabama countryside. They would get out of the car and straight away would begin their hike. At first it was mostly awkward because the two didn't know how to struck up a conversation, since again it was due to their past relationship and how badly it ended, until somehow they would begin a small chit chat, and that's how it would go. And they would keep walking until they got to this cliffside, and Daniel stopped Jolie and told her that, "We definitely need to take a photo of you right here because you look great." So a bit flattered and quite embarrassed, Jolie would say, "Okay, why not?" So now she's looking towards this view of the cliffside with her back faced against Daniel, and the whole time she was waiting for Daniel to go, "Yep, took the photos." But as she was waiting there, waiting for Daniel to give her a signal that the photos were over, she knew that it was taking quite a while. So of course, still facing away from Daniel, she would ask Daniel, "What's taking so long?" And Daniel would reply quickly by saying, "Sorry, my phone's being laggy." And just a second later, she would hear a click of a gun and then a gunshot. This hiking trip wasn't just a friend's hiking trip. It was a plan that Daniel had made to kill Jolie, because in his own words, he said that if I can't have it, no one can. and throughout the trip he would take pictures of him and Jolie and upload them to his Instagram before posting the final one where she was facing away from him looking into the view of the cliffside before ultimately shooting her and ending her life. The scary part about this whole thing was, before the night of the trip, when Jolie was texting her friends, she would randomly and in a jokingly way tell them that if something happens to me, you know who I'm with. All of her friends, along with Jolie herself, would laugh at this because of course they thought this was some sort of funny joke, but who knew that something actually terrible would happen to her. And after killing Jolie, Daniel would turn himself in straight away and would receive a 52-year life sentence. And here is a final picture of Jolie before she ultimately got killed. On February 12, 2017, 13-year-old Abigail Joyce, or known as Abby, and her friend 14-year-old Liberty Rose Lynn, or known as Libby, were getting ready to go on a hiking trip. The two had planned this trip for quite a while, and they were going to be going through the Monoan High Bridge. Monoan High Bridge was this quite narrow but tall bridge that was about 63 feet in the air, and it was also known to be the second tallest bridge in Indiana. The bridge was built in 1891, and was used by trains to carry goods over the Deer Creek, which was what was below the bridge, and eventually would be used until the bridge was abandoned by the main company in 1987. And ever since then, it has been abandoned and hasn't been touched. Since it was abandoned, it would make into this cool railroad bridge that had become quite popular because of its views, and of course it was abandoned. And people in the local areas, such as Abby and Libby, would go to this bridge and would take their many pictures and do sightseeing over there. And yet, even though it was abandoned, of course that meant nothing was touched, and the bridge was quite unsafe if you go to the right places. So technically every time you go on this bridge, you're risking your life just for a couple of pictures and sightseeing, because again, you never know when you step on the wrong place, a bridge might collapse or something might collapse that makes you lose your balance. But either way, with all them hazards, it doesn't really stop people from going to this bridge. Now the two got their gear ready the night before and was only one night away from their big adventure to the bridge. In the afternoon, they were going to be dropped off by Libby's older sister. Then they would spend their time on the bridge and on the trail that was leading to the bridge and away from the bridge. And then around about 3:30, they would meet Libby's father at the local car park. And so that was the main plan for the two. So the next day would arrive, February 13th, and the two would get dressed, would get their breakfast, and around about 1:35 p.m. they would find themselves in Libby's older sister's car, driving to the hiking trail. Eventually, once they got there, they would get out of the car, say goodbye to Libby's older sister, and they would watch as she would turn the car around and drive off into the distance. Once the car was out of view, the two would turn back around to face the trail and would get on their merry way. At around 3 p.m, Libby's father would arrive at the local car park where they were meant to meet up so that he can take them home. He would arrive, he would check the time, and then he would look up and the girls weren't here yet, so he would sit back, relax and watch a YouTube video while periodically looking up to see if the girls were coming towards him. 15 minutes would go by, so it's now 3:15, and there was still no sign of the two girls. And so Libby's father was beginning to think that, why are they taking so long? But eventually would chalk it up to them walking slow and taking their merry time and just enjoying the moment. But a whole 30 minutes would go by and there was still no sign of the girls, which at this point really started to worry the father. And now he's got out the car and would begin to walk through the trail where they were meant to come out from. But after walking for like 5 minutes, he would turn back around and would run back to his car and would call Libby's older sister and some other relatives, and he would tell them that, hey, the two girls aren't back yet, it's been about 45 minutes now, and I think something's bad happened to them, they must have got lost or something. So pretty quickly all the nearby family members would come to this trail and would begin to search for the two. They didn't want to call the police first because they thought that the two girls were just lost, or they were just fooling around and lost track of time. But after a lengthy search, the families couldn't find them at all, and that's when all of them would be like, yeah, it's time to call the police. The police would arrive and quickly search the entire area and trail, and would have all their intentions on finding the girls just being lost and kind of wandering around the forest. But after one day when the girls went missing at around about 1 p.m, they were discovered two bodies which were half a mile east of the abandoned Mono High Bridge, and those bodies belonged to Libby and Abby, and they were murdered. Along with the bodies, the police would find the phones of Libby and Abby, and well, after unlocking them, they would search through the phones to see if there's any clues to solve who did this, because straight away the police knew that they were killed. It was never specified on how they were killed, but they knew that foul play was involved. And at first the police wouldn't find anything until they got to the photo section of the phones. And as they begin to scroll through the recent photos of the girls, things would begin to kind of make sense. Well, kind of. One of the photos clearly shows of one of the girls just walking on the bridge, but at the distance behind the girl where the bridge starts, you can kind of see a shadowy figure of a man. Now it gets worse. The next thing on the camera was a video, and this man that was far away was now much closer to the girls and was making his way closer and closer towards the girls. And after that video there was nothing else, and it is believed that whoever this man was, he was responsible of killing the two girls. But the problem was, who is he? And this still remains the question till to this day. Here is a photo of the man that was minutes away from killing the two women. And our final story starts off with a man named Timothy Treadwell. He was what you called a bear enthusiast. He had so much passion for the bear species that he would become known as the Grizzly Man. His passion for bears would lead him to environmentalism and for documentary filmmaking. The subject, which were the grizzly bears of Katmai National Park in Alaska. And so really starting in the late 1980s, Mr. Timothy, or known as the Grizzly Man, began going to the Katmai National Park and setting up camp there for not just a couple of days or a couple of weeks, it was for the entire summer. And for the entire summer he would film all of his interactions with these bears. During the first half of the summer he would stay in this place where he called the Grizzly Sanctuary. It was like this area near Hollow Bay. It was just a big open green field, and it just seemed like all the grizzly bears would just converge into this one area and kind of just move around and be lazy in this area. And they were not aggressive at all towards Timothy, which was one of the main things about this place. And so he could walk up fairly close to these bears and get some good shots of them. And after the first half of the summer, he would go to another place called Kafley Bay, and this was kind of the opposite. It was much more densely forested area with lots of grizzly bear trails. And Timothy could use the vegetation of the forest to get really close to the bears without the actual bears seeing him, and he could take amazing photos. He would name this area the Grizzly Maze, but it wasn't really all high and good. Timothy, since he was, doing such dangerous stunts with one of the most scariest apex predators on our land, he would be known by all of the park rangers of Katmai National Park as pretty reckless. And every time he was going up to these wild beasts, he was essentially rolling the dice with his own life, because you never know what these beasts are going to do. And at the end of the day, you never know, they could just snap and attack you. And over time, as Timothy spent more and more time with the bears, he would generally become more and more attached emotionally to these bears. And at some point during his adventure, he would get so comfortable with the bears that he would walk up to these bears like he was one of their friends and would actually goof off with these bears. And one of the most dangerous parts was he would actually goof off with the bear cubs, which, if you don't know about female bears, they were very protective over their cubs. So the fact that he's just goofing off with the bear cubs puts him in a very dangerous spot. But for whatever reason, the parents of the cubs wouldn't do anything. And so this gave Timothy a signal that he was one of them and he was respected by them. Now when Timothy goes on these field trips in the summer, he would go alone. It was just him and his camera, and when the summer ended, he would leave. So when October of 2003 came along, it was time for Timothy to leave, because October time is where the grizzly bears become more aggressive towards anything, because they're trying to eat as much food as possible and get ready for their hibernation. So now bears get aggressive during this time of the year. You'd think that Timothy would leave like he usually does, but instead of Timothy leaving, he would say, you know what, I'm going to stay here for one more week. And this time he wasn't going to be alone. He's going to fly his girlfriend out to Alaska. His girlfriend, who was named Amy Huernerd, would fly into Alaska and would spend the rest of the week with him. And of course, once his friends and family heard about this idea, they were heavily against it, because they too knew what bears were going to be like during this time. But no matter what they told Timothy, he would kind of just shrug it off and would tell him that, you don't know these bears like I do, and they would never hurt me. So eventually he flies Amy out and they set up camp along this grizzly bear trail inside the Grizzly Maze. It was also a good time to mention that none of them were carrying a weapon or any bear repellent spray. This shows you how confident they were that the bears weren't going to attack them. Now skipping a week later, the pilot that was scheduled to pick up Amy and Timothy from their trip would arrive. So once he landed, he got out and he could instantly see there was a campsite right in front of him. And it wasn't too far and it was still intact, so clearly Timothy and Amy were still in there. So this indicated that they're okay, but they haven't packed up yet. So quite annoyed, he would walk up the hill towards a campsite, and throughout this little journey he would tell himself that the two must have lost track of time, hence why they're not ready. And as he goes over the hill so he can now finally see the campsite fully, because before he could only see the top of the campsite because again the hill was in the way. So once he goes over the hill, he just sees a massive huge grizzly bear that was in the campsite, pacing around the campsite as if he was guarding his prey. And once the pilot sees the bear also sees the pilot, and the bear would try to grunt to try to scare off the pilot, which of course would work because the pilot would do a 180 and run back to his plane and then would just fly out of there. And once he was ready, he would call the park rangers and he would alert them to the grizzly bear that was in the campsite of Amy and Timothy. When the park rangers finally arrived and made their way up to the campsite, they could tell right away that Amy and Timothy were both deceased and their remains had been scarred all over the campsite. It was clear a grizzly bear, or more than one grizzly bear, had absolutely ripped them to pieces. But this isn't the worst part about this story. As the bodies were being taken away from the campsite, the park rangers began to bundle up all of their belongings so they can take it with them. And one of them found the camera inside of one of the bags, and on this camera had a 6-minute tape. And of course he would play it, and all they could see was the inside of the tent that the two were in, because it was just all black. But it wouldn't be the visual that was a scary part, it was the audio. When they lifted up the sound, they could hear crystal clear audio of Timothy and Amy being eaten alive by a grizzly bear. The audio shows that Timothy had left the tent because they heard a grizzly bear outside, and once Timothy went outside, he was attacked. And so he starts screaming at Amy to come outside of the tent, and the bear has Timothy's head in between his jaws, and Timothy's just screaming, "It's killing me, it's killing me." And all Amy could do was just scream back, "Play dead." And at some point it's clear that playing dead wasn't working, and they have no way to fight this big grizzly bear. And so once the situation was dire, Timothy would tell Amy to just run away. But since she was so paralyzed with fear, she's screaming at the top of her lungs, and then Timothy's groaning and the screaming would eventually end. When the bear drags Timothy away, Amy doesn't try to run away. She's just kind of, frozen in terror and just paralyzed of the fear of what she's just saw. And then you can hear the bear coming back, and then her screams pick up, and then eventually that goes silent as well. And this is the last picture of the couple before they went camping on the bear trail, and also where they'll eventually be eaten alive by a grizzly bear. So that'll be it for today's video. If true crime stories intrigues your interest, or these type of videos intrigues your interest, then I would highly suggest you subscribe to my YouTube channel, as that's all I do and I upload once a week. But with all that being said, I thank you for watching, and yeah, goodbye.